Welcome to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I want to welcome to this week's episode, regular contributor, Representative Emily Kornheiser. How are you, Emily?
Hi, Olga. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Fresh from a day of legislating online. So yay, one more video conference. I'm so glad you can make it.
I'm glad to be here.
And then our guest this week, welcome back to the show, Stephanie Yu, who is the Deputy Director of the Public Assets Institute. And we are here today to talk about their annual report, their State of Working Vermont report, which if folks haven't read it, I will link to in the show notes. And so Stephanie, welcome. So glad you can be here.
Thanks for having me. Nice to be back.
Well, and I have to say, Stephanie, you have been such a trooper with this show because we're on our fourth year, we just started, and you have been here to talk about the State of Working Vermont report every year for the show.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So thank you for that.
So you don't have to.
Well, maybe someday we'll do it in person. I don't know.
That'll be fun. Someday we'll be able to do it in person, put it that way. So Stephanie, I would love to start with just dive right into the report. You know, one thing I found interesting with it is this is the second year in a row that your report has focused on the pandemic. Yippee skippy, right? But to me, it was such a time capsule. And it really did chronicle how the state and Vermonters in general have experienced the pandemic through all its different phases. And so for you, now that this is 2 years into it, what for you is standing out right now?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that's right. We really tried to think about what were the sort of moments that felt like a shift over the course of the pandemic and kind of chunk it out like that, because I think there were some pretty big moments. And it is unusual. Normally our report is kind of a look back at the prior year. We're using data from, usually the census data comes out in September for the prior year. And first of all, there wasn't census data this year because it was tough for census takers to go door to door in 2020. So a lot of the information just isn't there. So we had to get creative. But also I think that it's really tough to talk about workers in Vermont and not be talking about what the last almost 2 years now has been like. So we really felt like we had to focus on the pandemic. But I do think what stood out for us was a couple of things. One, that there really was a robust government response to the pandemic. And we don't know if we're going to need more. We don't know. We still have some federal money to spend, but there really was a very both sort of rapid and robust response by both state and federal government, which made a huge difference over the course of the pandemic. I think the biggest sort of question marks for us are, where are we going from here? I think we're probably all wondering, how close we are to putting this in the rearview mirror and or what else might be needed to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. Emily, just for listeners, I want to say quickly that some of the highlights from the report that Public Assets Institute outlined were how better people are when they have more money. And not only are they better materially, they are also better psychologically, and oddly enough, the economy does better. There was also a lot of emphasis on how members of the Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities and women were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and still are. And then also, like you said, Stephanie, how quickly government can meet people's needs when it's really focused and springing into action. For Emily, as someone who is in the legislature, when you hear this kind of feedback, what does it mean for you?
So as we start, the new year and the new session and the new phase of the pandemic, I've been thinking a lot about that period in the really like 1.5, mostly through the first phase. I don't really, sometime in April, I guess, of the first round, when things felt really hopeful in a certain way about what we were sort of figuring out and what we were prioritizing. And so what I've been thinking about a lot is what are the aspects of this that were interventions that really, really worked and that were temporary interventions that are going away now for reasons I cannot fathom, despite the considerable position of power I sit in. I still can't fathom why they're going away or how to get them back. But there were so many policy decisions that we made on the state level, on the federal level, in how we spend money and how we support communities that made a huge difference, and that would make a huge difference pandemic or not, that we were able to do. And so I'm really sitting a lot with what will it take to get these to stick around? And some of that is like in a very logistical way, like we used sort of systems temporarily. What would it take to make that system permanent? But a lot of it is how can I get other people's heads around like the incredible impact of what we were able to do and how it's worthwhile to continue it. So that's, and I heard that sort of echoed through the report, like, this is what we were able to do. Things are still difficult here. What happens now?
Stephanie, in the report writers talk about how policy could really changes to policy could change circumstances for a lot of Vermonters, especially women and members of the BIPOC community. What are some of the policy differences or policy changes that you think would make the greatest differences?
Well, I think, to Emily's point, I think that a lot of these policies should be in place on an ongoing basis. In other words, unemployment benefits should make sure that people have enough money to survive on all of the time, right? The need becomes much more visible in the pandemic. And I think we sort of talk about this in the report, the sort of visibility and the visibility of essential workers, which often low paid work, the visibility of groups that maybe didn't have as much visibility prior to the pandemic. And so I think, this is now front and center. So how do we sort of continue these pieces? But I think unemployment benefits is a good example where they've never been intended. They've never been designed to really either totally replace wages or capture everybody who's unemployed or make sure that people can meet their basic needs. None of those actually are in the design of the unemployment system. Setting aside what we remember as the sort of technology problems that the unemployment system had in the early days, partly because an influx of this size was just unprecedented, and partly because the systems are old and not very, functional, and it's difficult. But there were always these holes in the design, sort of by design, there were these holes that they weren't intended to meet all of the needs of the people who were using them. So I think we know that. I think we know that wages are low. Part of what we look at in this report is, and we have for the last few years, is sort of looking at what's more out of whack in Vermont. Is it wages or is it prices? We kind of do this comparison, and it's still true, right? That even the latest data that came out in December show that Vermont wages are about 15% below the US average, and prices are pretty average. I mean, there's some pockets of prices, particularly rent that tends to be, a little bit high in Vermont, higher than the US average. But overall, prices are pretty average in Vermont, and it's really the wages that are out of whack. So I think wage policy comes into this, absolutely. We certainly know that the early days, I think the childcare response was pretty robust. Vermont, even before we knew how much federal money we were getting for childcare, there was a real commitment to knowing that the providers need to be shored up, and also knowing that parents who couldn't actually send their kids to childcare shouldn't necessarily be expected to keep paying for childcare. So how do you kind of manage that system? So that's another area. I mean, there's a lot of areas, but I think that's another area where you can really kind of talk about specific policy changes. But I would say sort of writ large, it's really about making sure everybody has enough money in their pockets.
Mhm. Emily, we talked, I believe it was last week, about the governor's State of the State address. And one thing he did explicitly say was, at least from his perspective, that one reason Vermont's economy is dragging is that our cost of living is so high. You know, based on what just Stephanie just shared with us now, what's that kind of resonating with you?
I don't know, he's been saying that for a long time. He likes to say that. It's not true.
A lot of people like to say that, yeah.
Jeff just said that it wasn't true, you know, in the data, and that it continues to be wages that are low. And I think we've all experienced the wages being low. It's fairly remarkable if you've spent any time in like a national job market and then sort of returned to the Vermont job market. What's interesting now is sort of that's one of the new phase kind of ideas, which I think also feeds into some of what Steph was saying about unemployment and what a good unemployment system might possibly look like, is that we're now grappling with because the value of work is being considered in a different way, I think, by those who work. And the value of not working is also being considered by those folks. And the struggle to work is also part of the equation. And then just like, you know, childcare and pandemic hellscapes and all those things. So for all those reasons, we have employers who have needed to raise wages in order to attract workers. But we have a lot of employers that actually still aren't able to do that. And so, because they are the huge sector of Vermont's economy that is nonprofits, that is basically controlled by state dollars. Their wages are controlled by state dollars, and we don't move those state dollars to the extent that we need to actually make Vermont wages go up, which is a disconnect that the governor has not spent any time talking about in his various states of the state. And so we have that big bucket problem. And then there's the places where the wages don't go up because the employers they would rather put their profits somewhere else, like into the, you know, corporate. We all know the different places that profits can go. I'm not going to get into that. And so we have this like really interesting variation happening in Vermont around wages, around availability of work. But what I've started seeing in the last little bit is that people are really starting to blame workers for it in a way that even 3 months ago, I think would have been pretty unthinkable. We were still like all psyched up on the essential worker. And so, and for me, it's wrapped up in, I think as these benefit programs start to go away, we are losing track of they stand in for this like collective commitment to the greater good of each of us in some ways. And so I think it's harder for us to remember that like there was a point to all that. Like we are in this together, and everyone, like, it's interesting to me how government policy can sort of stand in for people sometimes, for sort of the moral imagination. I'm getting very theoretical. I don't know if doing this at 7 o'clock at night after a long day is really a great idea. So if someone could like rescue me from wherever this conversation is going, I'd appreciate it.
Well, I would say, if this is helpful, I would say that, you know, I do think wage policy is a big part of it for sure. But I also think, you know, government also does have this role to play on the cost side for people. Affordable housing, yes, healthcare, childcare, all those things. So there is also a cost side element to what government can do, and it's a critical piece. And I think some of what we've seen is, you know, housing prices can be, in some pockets of Vermont, they've grown quite a bit, and that's and the rental market is tough. So we know that is a real problem for people meeting the cost of housing. We know that eviction moratoriums, the rental assistant pot has really helped a lot of people, and the mortgage assistance as well, people in, you know, in homes as well. So, you know, I think there is this balancing act of how much do you do on the wage side, how much do you do on the cost side, and how do you kind of marry those to kind of make sure that there's not a bunch of cracks people are falling through.
Given that I'll step back. I often feel that economics for a lot of folks and the economy in general is a very personal thing. And we tend to define it by how we're experiencing it. So if our wages are feeling good and our job is feeling good, then we think the economy is good, and vice versa. For you, Stephanie, based on what you're seeing right now, either in this report or previous work that the Public Assets Institute has done, do you feel there are some myths about our economy or some things about how our economy works that you wish people would understand better?
Absolutely. I would say a couple of things. First, that one of the things we did with this, and we didn't put this in the report, but it was sort of some of our background work of the report. And I think our report last year was really a very different one in that we did a lot of interviews with people. We haven't done that too much, but we did a lot of kind of trying to get stories from how different people were just experiencing the pandemic. And we actually followed up with a number of them this year just to kind of check in. And, we didn't end up sort of filtering it into the report, but we have sort of been talking about it as we're talking about the report, about sort of the trajectory, in the early days of the pandemic, how scared were people? There was so much uncertainty. A lot of people were temporarily out of work, or, they were sort of on hiatus. Maybe they had a paycheck protection program loan at their, so they were being paid, but they didn't know if the job was going to come back or not. There was sort of a lot of upheaval. But, one of the, and I think a lot about with this report, the sort of multiplier effect of putting money in the pockets of people who then need to spend it, right? Who are spending it. And I think a lot of what we saw was that with those stimulus payments and with the unemployment benefits, that it was coming right back into the economy. I also don't like talking about the economy, right? In that way that the growth of the economy is sort of by itself an end and a good, right? Because there's all sorts of layers into that. And I don't think that we should be trying to put money in pockets so that state revenues increase, or, so that the economy grows a couple more percentage points or whatever it is. I think, I appreciated Emily's phrase of sort of the moral imagination. I think, we start with this idea that everybody should have enough. And if there are sort of indirect benefits to the economy, great. But the other thing that I would say is that I think there's a lot of, and sort of getting back to your question about kind of myths about the economy or thoughts about the economy, I will say one of the charts that we put in here was personal income. And personal income, it's one of these big sort of classic economic measures, but actually a lot of stuff goes into that. And some of it is, a lot of it's wages, but a lot of it is not wages, right? So what other sources of income do people have? And the big jump that we saw was in this category called transfer payments, which includes things like unemployment benefits and stimulus payments and those kind of things. It also includes some Medicaid and Medicare stuff. But essentially the chunk of wages stayed pretty steady. So even though of course there are individual families who, where their income is going up and down, and we saw sort of, there was a lot of churn for people, I think, but in the aggregate, we didn't see a huge sort of adjustment on that front. So I think that you're right. I think what you're saying is that people think about whether it's good or bad based on what they're experiencing, and based on like who the people close to them, or what the people close to them are experiencing, right? Their neighbors, their friends, their family, whatever. But then when we take a step back and look at it in the aggregate, personal income stays pretty steady, and in fact grows year over year. And if that's not happening for sort of the average Vermont family, then somebody else is accruing those benefits. Somebody in Vermont is accruing those benefits, right? And so where is that going? There is growth. It might not be going to the right places. And that's one of the things that we talk about a lot in terms of the sort of the income inequality challenge, and the fact that more and more income and wealth is being concentrated in fewer hands. And so, we try to sort of balance this conversation of what's happening in the aggregate versus what's happening to the average family, low income families, and really think about the same policy shouldn't apply.
Yeah, so today at the EBoard meeting, which I will explain in a few minutes what the EBoard is, because I'm sorry for any listeners who even know what the EBoard is. So there was a conversation between the state economist and the governor and the chairs of the legislative money committees with this talk of like the economy's booming, state revenues are booming. And then the question from the chairs of the legislative money committees was, but we know there are people whose lives are not booming right now. And so we want to spend these booming revenues in that place. Can you point to for us the people who are struggling during the like the people who were left behind by the pandemic or saw their experiences compromised during the pandemic, or however to phrase it. And that question seemed almost unavailable to answer from this sort of macro view of the economy, which was about sort of construction statistics and car buying and all of these. It was about consumption writ large and not really who was consuming or how or where the money from that consumption went in the end beyond state coffers. And that the tools weren't sort of at our fingertips in that conversation to be making that exact shift that you talked about was really surprising to me. And so before I'll just say the EBoard is, this is a little sidebar for listeners, little legislative education moment. The EBoard, don't ask me why it's called the EBoard. It stands for, I believe, Emergency Board, which still doesn't really make any sense to me, but I'm sure there's a really good reason that we can get into some other time. But
they can act if needed. They're empowered to act in an emergency.
In a budgetary emergency, which is like, what would that possibly be? It's sort of fun to think about. But they have this very ceremonial role twice a year, where Vermont is actually one of the few states, maybe the only state, I'm not sure, one of the few states that does this joint forecasting. Many states do it. Okay. We do this very fun joint forecasting where the governor and the legislature agree on what they think the revenues coming into the state are in advance of the budget process. So the budget is set to the amount of revenues that people think are coming in and everyone agrees on it. There's not one budget number from the legislature and one budget number from the governor. And it includes a grand presentation from the state and the legislative economists about sort of the state of the economy. And usually everyone sits in like velvet chairs in the governor's office and there's a lot of pomp and circumstance, but that didn't happen this year. It was just inside the computer. So
I don't know that it's many states. It may be about half. I'd have to look for sure, but it is definitely best practice that let's agree on the number we're working with before we start talking about the budget. So it's definitely best practice, and Vermont does it.
So Steph, I'm curious, Emily talked about how folks were measuring the economy and how much of it was based on consumption. Do you feel there are other measurements or data points that would behoove the state to consider when looking at the health of the economy or Vermonters?
This is a big part of why we do the report. You know, I think a lot of people do kind of pay attention. You know, there's sort of these big markers, classic markers, like gross state product, like personal income, total personal income. That's just sort of everybody's in the state put together. You know, and we look at things that are more, I think, slightly more people oriented, like poverty rate, like, you know, wages at the different levels. How are they moving or not moving? And try to think about that. You know, inflation's another one I think that a lot of people are sort of talking about right now. It seems to be a pretty hot topic, and it's one that I think is much more nuanced conversation than sort of how it shows up in the media and in the public discourse. I think most of these things are, right? Like that's sort of the nature of the soundbite. But so I think, you know, we're always looking at particularly sort of how are families doing? Can they meet their basic needs? You know, Vermont is one of the few states that has this basic needs budget concept, which we put out every 2 years. You know, the Joint Fiscal Office works on this and says, this is what a livable wages or a livable income is for a family in this circumstances or a family of this size. And we don't do anything with it, but we say it, you know, and I think the goal is that we do more with it. I mean, we do, you know, we sort of use it as a marker in certain ways, but But again, like something like unemployment benefits, something like reach up benefits aren't tied to it, which I think is sort of the intent, right? That we know what people need to live on, and we could be meeting that standard.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes before we need to hear from some of our underwriters. So either Emily or Stephanie, what do you feel right now is good for listeners to understand?
Well, you know, I think, again, I think the goal is that there's actually space for people to have input on the state budget. I think that there should be input on how we use these federal dollars, on whether we think these programs should continue, and sort of what are the programs that are helping people the most. You know, what is making the difference for people, and communicating that. I think that's really critical, because we're sort of at this decision point with a lot of these things.
Thank you. Emily, anything you want to add before we?
Sort of in the context for how do we transition these like incredibly valuable emergency supports into more permanent ones, I'm thinking a lot about sort of the concept of deserving and what it means for us to think about how we think about that. And what I think made all of this more possible was because of the pandemic, there was a broader understanding that like no one's circumstance was their fault. And I hope that whatever that was is a framework that we could carry in some way into sort of this next conversation about what Vermont looks like and what it means for Vermonters to have their needs met. Like Steph said, like we don't want to just say it's important to get, you know, money to lower income folks because they spend it and that creates revenue, right? It's like there needs to be a different frame that goes beyond fault and bootstraps. And we had it for a minute, and I'm still just sort of like looking at it in the rear view mirror, remembering sort of what it felt like to hold it and trying to figure out what it would look like to make that comfortable to hold for a longer period of time.
Thank you. We shall return here on the Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, right after a word from our underwriters. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. If you're just joining us, I am your host, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how things in Montpelier shake out for the rest of us. And I'm speaking with regular contributor, Representative Emily Kornheiser, and Stephanie Yu, the Deputy Director of the Public Assets Institute, which is based in Montpelier. And we've been talking about PAI's annual State of Working Vermont report. We touched on before the break, Emily, we need to remind people of something.
Oh yeah, thanks. Views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the hosts and the guests separately, and not the views and opinions of their employers or the radio station or the TV station or the streaming channel or people near them in the same building, anything like that. They're just their own views and opinions.
Party goers, that kind of thing.
Yeah, the party goers in the background. Stephanie, before the break, we were talking a little bit about inflation, and I think there's been a lot of talk in the news sphere about inflation. I know my father has been complaining about it to me on a regular basis for the past few weeks. What's it looking like in Vermont right now?
So, I mean, I think probably what everybody has been hearing about is sort of these trends in inflation over the last year across the country, not just in Vermont. But again, sort of where we started with this conversation was just sort of wages being more out of whack than prices in Vermont, and that's still true. I'll also note that we did, you know, one of the charts in our report looks at real wage growth. So that's adjusted for inflation, and we're still seeing some wage growth even after adjusting for inflation. Again, all of that sort of comes with the caveat that a lot of the jobs that were lost were low wage jobs. So not all of that is real growth. Some chunk of that is, just fewer low jobs on the low end make things look better.
Right.
So all these, sort of the way numbers can trick us sometimes. But what I will say about inflation is that is a couple things. Like, it can actually be, there's sort of pros and cons. And I think it is a more nuanced conversation. There's a lot of information about sort of what inflation is measuring, what it's capturing of the economy, how much has the definition kept up with sort of similar to sort of something like our tax code, where we sort of chased the services versus the goods economy. I think there is an element of what is it actually measuring. And then, I think there's also, a school of thought where some inflation can be good, especially for at the lower end, for lower income folks, because oftentimes, essentially, they're sort of paying off debt with cheaper money. And so there can be some benefits to it. It's not all completely just a negative thing all the time. And oftentimes who inflation is bad for can be people, who are holding a lot of money. So that's sort of a different sort of perspective on it. But I also recognize that you can go to the grocery store, you can go to the gas station, and you can see a real adjustment, and that feels like it's something to complain about. It's something that does hit. And obviously you certainly want your wages to be keeping up with whatever your costs are. And the fact that our wages have been out of whack for a long time, continue to be out of whack, even while we might have closed the gap a little bit this year, but there was some real wage growth and some improvement, but there's the wage is still the problem. So whichever side of it is the problem, it's a problem for people, right? If that gap grows, it's a problem for people. So, I recognize that. But I think overall, we're not seeing huge jumps in a lot of things. Again, the housing and rental market is one of those, is a little bit of a trickier conversation. But I think sort of the things you hear about with gas and food are relatively modest. And again, we're seeing wage growth even after adjusting for inflation. So there's some balancing out there.
So my biggest question about all of that is that what I hear from people is like, we overshot and created inflation. And so we should stop all of these programs, all these government spending programs that we've just spent the first half of the show talking about how awesome they are. And so what do we do about that idea? What do you think about that idea?
I think the reality is pretty different from the idea. So I think you got to fight it. It's a battle of ideas, not a battle of sort of real policies, I think.
Yeah.
So, and what I mean by that is we're very clearly seeing that the unemployment benefits, that the stimulus payments, that these are all going into people meeting their basic needs. Sort of writ large, that's where the spending is, right? We see these adjustments in spending, but where that money is going is for people to meet their basic needs. So it's really not sort of, sort of discretionary spending, right? But the other piece of that is long day for me too. Give me a second. Is that I think so again, people are spending the money on the basic needs, and again, the economy is not necessarily reflective of what this sort of writ large economy is not necessarily reflective of what people are really experiencing. One point that I was going to make is, I think we're also seeing a lot of these stories about kind of companies increasing profits, like you said, right? Where is it a real price increase, or is it an opportunistic sort of situation? Kind of combined with sort of all these stories you're hearing about the supply chain challenges and all these things. There's sort of there is some opportunism in there too, I think. So.
Thank you, Emily. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. I also have this so I, in my Brattleboro bougie middle class self, tend to buy very local milk and very local produce and very local eggs. and very local bread that often comes from local grains. And I do not say this to say that like there is anything superior about doing that at all. Like people make such decisions are quite emotional, and I understand that. I think a lot of people would think that like I overspend on those things normally. What's been interesting is that as the prices for all of these other sort of grocery store items have gone up, the price of those things has stayed totally steady for the last 2 years in my life. And so when people were first started talking about stuff, I'm like, price of milk and meat and eggs and bread is like my market basket costs the same. And so that's a really interesting, like, I don't know, it's just like an interesting piece of the mix of the whole thing. And I don't want to draw huge conclusions from it. I think there's probably less opportunism in that kind of much more tight market. There's less supply chain challenges in that tight market, but there's also probably more of just a resistance to move towards the need for real prices in that market because you know your consumers so well. So I don't want to draw conclusions from it. It's just sort of like a fun Vermont aspect of the whole thing.
But I think you're raising a question, which is a good question about sort of what's sustainable in the economy and what's not. I mean, I think the supply chain breakdowns do kind of point to, one, how dependent we are on getting things quickly from far away, and how big of a challenge that can be when that doesn't happen, and sort of what are the other costs that are built into the way that we sort of consume, which are things like paying low-wage workers, essential work that we knew was really important at the start of the pandemic, grocery store workers, and I'm not sure we've solved their wage problem. So while we recognized it for a time there, I think this is sort of what you were saying about holding that idea that this is the collective good and that we should be kind of thinking about it from a what do we owe each other perspective. I think there's also these other things which are like what are the other hidden costs in the way that we consume, and I think that's also to sort of Olga's earlier question about what do we not think about when we talk about the economy.
That your comment, Stephanie, brings me to workforce, and in all my reporting, probably for the past year, every time I talk to someone, I'm hearing housing and workforce, housing and workforce, housing and workforce. And the State of Working Vermont report did dive into some workforce numbers. And of course, now that I open my report, I can't see the graph I was looking for. But you talk about like who dropped out of the workforce or how many jobs we had before and after the pandemic, and that there were some paradoxes in some of the numbers you were seeing. Can you walk us through that, please?
Sure. So I think we've heard a lot about sort of the worker shortage or workforce shortage. We've also heard a lot about sort of what some people are calling the Great Resignation or a trading up, right, of jobs. And so there's a lot of churn still happening. I think that's the main takeaway, is that this whole thing hasn't settled. We're still in a pandemic. We're still sort of dealing with a lot of ups and downs and school challenges and childcare challenges and demand challenges, right? In terms of, are people comfortable going out? Where are we with different things? But we are down. The labor force has shrunk about 25,000 people from where it was pre-pandemic. So that's a healthy chunk. Maybe it's an indication of an unhealthy chunk. But and what we don't know is how much of that is permanent and how much of that is people trying to weather whatever they're trying to weather, whether it's their own health considerations, whether it's childcare or other caregiving responsibilities. How much of this is going to come back and how much of this is really people choosing to retire early. People, I think there's a fair amount of that. Again, we were trying to get a lot of numbers on sort of retired teachers and different things in Vermont specifically, and we really had a tough time because the data just aren't there, because so much of it is in flux and or kind of just a lot of the kind of typical processes have been on hold or on pause throughout this the last couple of years. So I think we are really thinking about what does this all mean. I think we also, a lot of I think I said this earlier, a lot of what happened at the beginning of the pandemic was that a lot of the jobs that got shut down were low-wage jobs. So are they coming back in the same places? To some extent, we know that the hospitality industry, for example, is not totally back, but there are some sectors where they're more than back, right? They're ahead of where they were pre-pandemic. And we just don't quite know how it will all settle out. But part of what we are seeing, and I think this is sort of this great resignation story, is that that job openings are now much higher than available workers, right? So who are the people still, that are actually engaged and actively looking for work? It's a pretty small number versus people who, again, might be staying sort of on the edges of the labor market until they feel like they're in a better place and able to work versus what's a permanent decision. That was sort of a long-winded answer, so I want to let people respond. But I think we could also talk some about the gender disparities that we're seeing too.
I really want to talk about the gender disparities. Before we do that, I wonder if we could just have a brief informational interlude where we explained the difference between someone being unemployed and someone being out of work and someone being out of the workforce, and like that whole wild continuum of data that I think sometimes gets smushed together into one big ball. Are you able to do that stuff for us?
I'm happy to do that, and I appreciate you saying that, because I think you're right, and I think this is another one of those terms that might not mean exactly what it sounds like it means, right? When we talk about the labor force, we are talking about either people who are working or are actively looking for work. And part of what was weird about this pandemic, so those are who we call the unemployed. They're actively looking for work. I mean, there are some people who are employed and also actively looking for work, which is a different subset. But we typically look at this. There's a chunk that's employed. There's a chunk that's unemployed. And to be officially unemployed means that you are actively looking for work. However, and to draw down unemployment benefits, you need to be actively looking for work. However, during the pandemic, all these definitions sort of got thrown out the window temporarily. So first, there was no expectation that you were looking for work because there weren't jobs, because we were trying to have a lockdown, because we knew that schools and childcare and all these things were shut down. There was temporarily not a work requirement. So you could get counted as unemployed whether you were looking for work or not, but it wasn't necessarily included in the official unemployment rate. So it's a very screwy, and these numbers have been pretty screwy over the course of the pandemic. In addition to that, one of the big benefits of the pandemic was that we expanded unemployment benefits to people who wouldn't normally qualify, who aren't sort of normally counted in those labor force numbers, mostly the self-employed, right? So a big chunk of that is the self-employed who don't typically get counted. And so are sort of just this shadow chunk of the labor force that we don't talk about, and suddenly we're counting them in a different way. So it's been very sort of screwy, but I will say, and we also look at things like labor force participation rate, who could be working and what share of the people who could be working are working. But when we look at that, it's 16 and up. So it includes anybody 16 and over. So it includes the retired, people who are retired. So when you look at those participation rates, it's sort of like, what is the denominator here? What are we talking? What's the universe of people that this even includes? So a lot of those things are shifting. So when we talk about being out of the labor force, it means that you're not employed or actively looking for work. And what we don't know is, have you retired officially? Are you definitely done? Are you considering coming back in under the right circumstances?
Did you have such a spate of childcare disasters that you just decided to take a break from even trying anymore? Because
are you immunocompromised and not ready to, and not able to be back in the workforce? All of these things. Yeah.
One thing, this is a slight tangent, and maybe this has changed, and so please correct me, Steph. One thing I find very interesting is it always seems to me that a lot of folks in Vermont work more than one job. And I'm not sure, do we track that? Do we track
So there is some tracking of that. It's a really good question. And that's one thing we were trying to get to the bottom of. And really the data there's such a lag in the data that we couldn't answer that question sort of in a timely way relevant to the pandemic yet. We will be able to eventually. So, but I think you're also calling attention to an important distinction, which is the distinction between jobs and the employed, right? So a job, and the way we count jobs when we talk about sort of jobs coming back or not coming back, those are employer payroll jobs. Again, tends to leave out the self-employed. But you're right, a person who's employed could have 2 jobs. So those numbers are not going to line up. You know, a lot of the universe is the same, but they're not a 1-for-1 match.
Interesting. I always thought that would be an interesting number because it might speak to how many people aren't living off of one, you know, it takes more than one job to meet your needs. That is a question for me sometimes.
Well, you know, part of what we've tried to tease out with this report is what's happening to people. Like, I think you're right. And one of the things we wanted to look at were, did a lot of people reduce their hours? You know, there may be people who are in jobs that have a good leave system. And so we're able to bridge enough leave and balance the childcare responsibilities such that they show up as full-time employed, but that's not their reality. Their reality is that the organization is not, you know, they're not doing as much work for the organization, and, you know, they're pulled in a lot of different directions. Another option might be that many people who had 2 jobs went down to 1 job to you know, to deal with this stuff. And we just don't have the data to really kind of know for sure, but that's on our list. We're watching for it for sure.
How did you see the disparities in the workforce show up around gender and around racial disparities?
So, you know, what's interesting is I think, again, there's sort of been this broad national narrative about women, especially, you know, mothers and caregivers bearing the brunt of the childcare, you know, the school closures and childcare closures. And what's interesting is that the Vermont numbers are really kind of a mixed bag. I think there was a lot of attention being paid to the early unemployment numbers showed that there were a lot more women getting unemployment than men in the early days in Vermont. I think we have a chart in there saying that jobs held by women have dropped more than jobs held by men.
Yeah.
But it's really kind of a mixed bag. And so I am curious to kind of get to the bottom of that. Part of the challenge is that those unemployment numbers are not, again, reflecting all of the people that are unemployed. They're reflecting some segment of those people. So we really don't have the full picture. You know, we certainly recognize that sort of a lot of the kind of gender disparities that we see in the labor force across the country are true in Vermont, which is that there is a wage gap. So if there is a need for childcare, or, you know, what is the calculus that a family is making? If there's certainly more single mothers than there are single fathers. So when there's a childcare issue, you're going to see it hit some groups of women harder for sure. But, you know, it wasn't a kind of obvious here, you know, it's very clear this is affecting women much more than men. One thing that I will say is, I think following the Great Recession, there was unemployment for men was much higher and stayed much higher for a long time. And a lot of that had to do with what were the sectors that were losing jobs during the Great Recession. A lot of it was construction, manufacturing, jobs that are dominated by men typically. And what we saw this time around is that we can say that, you know, for example, the hospitality sector in Vermont is actually more evenly divided than in most states. Like it's pretty 50-50 before the recession.
I didn't know that.
Before the pandemic. Yeah. So it's sort of interesting, but so it wasn't a function of the fact that these were where most of the jobs were lost. And most industries are pretty skewed one way or the other. Most sectors tend to be like 75-25%, like where it's 75% men or 75% women. Like it does tend to be pretty skewed. Change the Story has great work on this. Yeah. But the hospitality industry in Vermont is less true here than in a lot of places. So it's just interesting. So it's not a function of the sector was hit so hard and therefore it impacted women more, unlike in the Great Recession where that was sort of the story. So there's just some quirks that, you know, are hard to kind of map together in a coherent story.
And talk to me a little bit about racial disparities. Did you see that in the workforce, or did you see that mostly in health outcomes?
A lot of what we were focused on was the share of cases and the vaccination rates. You know, I think the Department of Health has paid, again, I think, you know, there was a recognition that we needed to be tracking all of these data by race, you know, sort of intentionally and thoroughly, and keeping an eye on it. And so I do think that that really informed the public health policies, you know, when the governor and health officials made the decision to open vaccines up earlier to BIPOC communities. There's been a lot of effort, a lot of outreach to do BIPOC specific clinics. So I think that that has helped sort of address those, but you know, there are persistent health disparities across racial lines in everything, you know, COVID, no, not COVID, pandemic, because because there's so many systemic inequities across, you know, housing, across, you know, economics, across earnings, across all of these different places that make BIPOC communities more vulnerable to any of these, you know, sort of broad crises. But I will say what, you know, and again, I think Vermont's numbers are small, but what was true in the Great Recession, and it's true pretty much whenever there's economic downturns, is that BIPOC communities are the last to recover, right? That they tend to be unemployed the longest. There tends to be the sort of hardest hit, and I think that's, you know, likely to persist, right?
Yeah.
And for listeners who are sort of thinking about the BIPOC vaccine clinics, there are also, whenever there's a state distribution of testing supplies, there's usually a large allotment that's set aside for distribution by BIPOC-led organizations. And so you might not be aware of that if you're listening. And so if you are listening and that would be of interest to you, there's lots of sort of routes to finding those organizations. They're usually not publicized all that well because tests are in short supply. And so if that's something that you're trying to figure out, please feel free to be in touch and I'll help you wind your way.
And I will say the Vermont Professionals of Color Network has done a great job really pushing out a lot of information about the clinics and about the test availability too.
Thank you, both of you. We have just a few minutes left, but I want to just kind of tie this up a little bit. Early in the pandemic, and Emily mentioned this during the break, that there was a lot of talk about a K-shaped recovery. And as Emily put it very, very well, what letter of the alphabet are we on now at this point when it comes to recovery stuff?
I'm not sure that there's a letter with enough bumps to describe sort of what's been going on and where we are. I was going to say W, but even that doesn't quite cut it. You know, yeah, I think there's always, I think it's a good follow on to sort of the disparity conversation that we're having, because I think that there are pockets that are really, and to Emily's point earlier, you know, so the economy is booming, great, but we want to identify the pockets where that's not true. Right. And what do we do about those pockets that aren't true? So, you know, I really think that part of this feels like the story is not over. You know, we really wrestled with this report. Like, we know we're still in the middle of it, and is this going to have a shelf life at all? You know, is there going to be another variant, or is there going to be another, you know, I don't know we didn't feel very certain about, I don't think any of us feel very certain about what the future holds. But so I think that's, you know, what I would say is that there's sort of a pause, like we just don't quite know which direction we're going right now. And so I think that's kind of, we're still trying to figure it out, and we just don't know how it's all going to shake out. So I wish I could say it was a V and we were on the upswing, or, you know, something, but I don't think we know.
I guess I would ask you, I don't know how close we are to tying this bow, Olga.
No, you're good.
Okay. You're good. So the sort of nature of the K-shaped recovery was that some people were having a jolly time of it financially in the economy and the pandemic, and some people were having a very difficult time of it in the pandemic financially. And so I guess I would wonder what policy tools are in front of us today that would serve to close that gap in a
Yeah.
sustainable way.
Well, I think it's a very different set of policies that bring the bottom of the K up versus bring the top of the K down, and maybe both are of interest. But I think exactly where we started this conversation of making sure that people have enough money in their pockets, I think is the main thing under any circumstances. So your unemployment benefits should give you enough money in your pockets. If you can't work and have been out of work for a long time or permanently, you should have enough money in your pocket to make it work. And, no matter how large your family is, no matter what, all of these sort of under all of these sort of circumstances, you should have enough money in your pocket. So I really think it's wage policy, but it's also the benefit policy, whether it's 80,000 Vermonters who are needing unemployment or whether it's 2,000 Vermonters who are needing unemployment, the goal should be the same, right? Of keeping them whole. And more than whole if in fact it's a low wage job that isn't cutting it, right?
And then how do we bring the top of the K down? And then I guess we're just turning the whole thing into an M dash. Is that the idea?
Yeah, flatten it all. Yeah, I think again, we've talked a lot about sort of the tax policy piece of things. Vermont's done some work on capital gains, for example, and some of those things that really have the top pulling away. We sort of just learned to live with the Trump tax cuts. Some of them expire, some of them don't, but they benefited a lot of Vermonters, and that's a big difference. And not just those that last round of tax cuts for the wealthy, but sort of cumulatively over the last 20 years, that's really where that money has gone. So, I think there's plenty of room for correction on that front. And I think there's also plenty of sort of conversation, and this might not be a state level conversation so much, but plenty of conversation about what's reasonable for a company, how a company can profit from these kind of things. There's a lot of people making a whole lot of money during this pandemic, and that doesn't feel quite right.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Stephanie and Emily. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Stephanie, if people want to read this report, like I said, I will link to it in the show notes, but where can they also find more of PAI's reports and press releases, that type of thing?
So our website is publicassets.org, or also I'm on Twitter at PAI Steph, and then Public Assets is also on Twitter, and we always link and kind of promote all our stuff there, of course on Facebook. So pretty easy to find, I think.
Thank you. Hey, Emily, if people need to reach out to you, what's the best way to do that?
Folks can go to emilykornheiser.org, where you'll find links to my regular newsletters you can sign up for or read them in my blog. You can find my Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram there. I have started posting again on all of the glorious social media channels now that the legislative session started, so that might actually be interesting again. And you can also even just find my phone number there, and starting weekly office hours again this Sunday if folks want to come join the Zoom room with me.
Fantastic. So right before we toast, I just want to remind people that you can find the Montpelier Happy Hour wherever you find your podcasts, as well as our webpage, the montpelierhappyhour.captivate.fm, as well as BCTV and right here on WVEW 107.7. So Emily and Steph, I want to toast to this report, and I want to thank Steph and all your colleagues for helping us understand how Vermont's economy works that much better. So cheers. Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Have a great weekend, everyone. We will see you next Friday.